Now, the other thing that caught our attention, and maybe has caught your attention well, is a little bit closer to home, what's happening at Asbury University in Wilmore, Kentucky. If you're not familiar with Asbury University, some of you know, yes, come on. It is a small Christian college. Pastor Les, 9 years there, is that right? 9 years there. I've
not in college for 9 years.
No. Yeah, it's good. It's good to clarify that. My brother went to school there. I've got several friends there as well. And so on February 8th, the Lord showed up at their very simple weekly chapel service. They were just having what they always do for the college, and students were there listening to the speaker and worshiping a little bit, and they dismissed chapel. And there was a little group of students who chose not to leave. And they just decided, we're going to keep worshiping and we're going to keep praying. And the music continued, and it continued for a couple hours. And by lunchtime, people were like, oh, this is interesting, and started to kind of check out what might be happening there. And I had a friend, it's actually the friend who connected Pastor Les and I, Tom Tanner, who happened to be on campus that morning. And he's getting texts from people saying, hey, chapel started at 10 a.m. and it hasn't stopped. And so he thought, well, I should go check this out and see what's happening. And he made his way back to the chapel by dinner time, and it was full again. And the students had all come back into this chapel. 1,700 students are now flooding back into this chapel, and God's Spirit is moving among them. And it goes into the night, and then into the next day, and into the next night, and the next day, and the next night, and the next day. And here we are. It's February 19th. 11 days later, it's still going. And these college kids are continuing to worship God. Isn't that beautiful? When we hear the word revival as a church, as individuals, you might be like, man, what do I do with that? And what even is that? And I just want to take a minute, and we're going to share together like some shared language that we have around our understanding of how God moves in these ways. And this isn't like from a theological dictionary. There's a lot of different versions of this out there, but this is language that I think we can share together so we can have a common understanding, because we want to be a church that carries revival in our hearts. And if you don't know that, then here's the news. We want to do that, and we want to be about that. So what exactly is that? Well, there's this word called outpouring that is just kind of a general term that is like a banner over all these other things that God often does: renewal and revival and awakening, all the things you've probably heard before. Outpouring, my understanding, is kind of the general term. And it basically means it's a sovereign move of God. It's a sovereign move of God, meaning God's moving all the time. He's speaking all the time. He's operating all the time. But in certain times and in certain situations, God determines that he's going to pour out his Spirit in a very unique way. And I think it's important when those things happen, we don't have to try and figure out why it happened the way that it did. It just happened. And when those things happen, I think our hearts are, how do we respond? And really what it is, how would you define that? I would say it's the closest thing to heaven that any of us will experience in this life, because God's presence comes so close, you just don't want it to end.
We share these things to build your faith. Our desire is, God, come any way you want, anytime you want, but just come among us. We long for you to do this. Now, when that happens, when we're refreshed, when we're renewed, when we're convicted, what often happens with revival is an awakening.
Like, how are we going to respond to this? It's the question I've been carrying in my heart this week. And I'm sitting by the fire yesterday on our little Sabbath day, and it wasn't anything like impressive at all, but this little whisper from the Lord: can you be a church of both formation and fire? Formation and fire. Can you be a church that's about what we talked about this fall? Cultivate the spiritual disciplines, the Spirit-led spiritual disciplines, prayer and worship and fasting and just doing the basics of what it is to follow Jesus, becoming like him for the good of the world, that in our individual lives, day in and day out, we're walking as close to Jesus as we possibly can. To be a church of formation, so the Spirit can form, can cultivate in us his fruit and his power, his voice, but also to be a church of fire. To be a church where there's atmospheres, where change is happening in a moment, where people are delivered, where restoration is released, where marriages are healed at the altar and not through months and months of premarital or marital counseling. Where where addiction is broken and where inner healing is released. And y'all, I love counseling. I'm all about counseling. I got a counselor. He can tell you all about me. I'm a mess. When we gather, we don't just do church, but we are the church. And we look more like Acts than we do many of the churches we see today. I think we can be a church of both formation and fire. And I want to say yes to that. And I want us to respond to that. So even now, like in our services, all of our campuses, we're going to give space and we're going to give time to worship together and open our hearts up to what God may want to do and say among us.